Welcome to the Man Rules Podcast. If you're looking to live with more intention, build connection, and live a more authentic, meaningful life, you're in the right place. I'm your host, Dan Griffin. I don't know about you, but it seems to me that they keep changing the rules for us men without telling us. So each week, I just throw out the rule book and cover the tough topics about the real issues that men face. At the end of the day, I'm not here to tell you what kind of man you're supposed to be. I'm here to help you make your own rules and become the kind of man you want to be. So let's jump in. All right, welcome back to another episode of the Man Rules Podcast. Very excited to be here with my next guest, John Lee. For those of you who have paid attention to men's issues in recovery, men's issues in health and psychological, spiritual well-being for the last 20 or 30 years, you know John Lee, you know his name. He's an incredible leader and voice in the name of vulnerability and putting the story of men that was untold out into our culture and into the larger conversation. John has definitely been one of the wonderful leaders. So it's an incredible honor, John, to have you with me as I launch this podcast. So thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you, Dan. It's my pleasure and honor, and I appreciate you thinking of me this way and having me on your show.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so much we could say for listeners who may not be familiar with you. We'll give them an opportunity at the end for you to just let everybody know exactly how to find you.
Okay.
But how many books at this point have you done?
23, and I'm working on number 24 and 25 as we speak.
Oh, my gosh.
23 so far. The first one, of course, being the first bestseller I had. And the last, well, not exactly the last, The Flying Boy Healing the Wounded Man came out about 34 years ago.
Wow.
And it has done very well. It was a national bestseller, still in print. And then Flying Boy 2 also became a national bestseller. And then since then, I've wrote a number of books on men's issues, recovery issues, anger, grief, relationships, creativity, spirituality. And that's why I'm old and tired, is because I've been working too hard.
Well, you've done an incredible amount of service. I had the pleasure of talking with Terry Real yesterday. You know, I thought about it and I thought, you know what? If people just read everything that Terry's done and everything that you've done, there's really not a whole lot more to say.
Well, he certainly said a great deal himself and has put a lot out there. And you know, it's kind of like, you know, Robert Bly and I, James Hillman and Michael Mead was sort of, and others were sort of, you know, the first wave. And then he came along and started, and in some ways we might think of him as the second wave that has gotten so much good information out and is so popular with readers.
Yeah. It seems to me that it's building upon itself in a really special way, that there are those of you who really hit something in our culture that, you know, that deep wound that was so invisible in many ways and yet so obvious once we hit it, has that opened a conversation that I think continues to grow. And, you know, I'd be interested to know from you, my observation seems to be that we're at a point in 2017 and really in this 21st century, but in the last 10 years in particular, where our society's focus and willingness to focus in a more comprehensive and compassionate way toward men is at a place that it maybe has never been, as far as the depth and how many people are engaging in it. Do you think that's accurate? Or is that just one of the waves?
Yeah, it's one of those things where both and. In some ways, see, it really is like a good news, but there is some not so good news. I won't call it bad news. But one of the things that I think every conversation about men has to start with is the contribution that Robert Bly, the poet Robert Bly, made beginning in 1981. If it wasn't for Robert, you and I wouldn't be talking, you know. He is really the recognized father of men's movement, men's work stuff.
Absolutely.
And so it's really gone through cycles, Dan. It's when we first started, it was like huge. I mean, we would have, Robert would have, I would have 500, 1,000 men sitting in the auditorium, you know. And then he did that thing with Bill Moyers called A Gathering of Men. And that was such a successful thing. And then he wrote the book Iron John. And that's what really ignited the fuse. And then so we all worked through the 80s and early 90s, mid 90s. And then it started tapering off, but in a way that doesn't really mean tapering off. It went from 1,000 men sitting in the auditorium to 150 men sitting, you know, at a campsite or, you know, wherever we would hold the conference. But then it went to, and this is, again, the good news, then it went to groups of 10 and 12 and 15 all over the United States. And so what once was 1,000-person gathering, which now doesn't happen, Terrence and I together, and, you know, several other people couldn't pull 1,000 together. But those 15 men that are spread out all over the United States, New Zealand, England, Australia, Germany. Well, see, that's where the hope is. That's where the good news is. They've taken it from the macro to the micro, but really the micro is bigger than the macro ever was. And men still hunger for this stuff as much as they ever have, but there's also, it's just not on the, let's put it this way, it's not on the front cover of Time magazine like it was for Robert back in, say, 88 or 89.
That's right. It seems that with some of the cultural conditions that are coming together politically, socially, culturally, we might see this on the cover of Time magazine again in the next 3 to 5 years.
Yes, especially if some young man, how old are you, Dan?
I'm 44.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Some young man.
Young is relative, right?
Yeah. We need young men, younger men, and I do mean, you know, late 20s, 30s, 40s, to speak to the generations that might not quite resonate with, say, the material of Robert or me, more so probably Terrence in some ways. But even though I'm 66, that puts you and I a generation apart.
Yeah.
Your generation got things that mine and Robert's did not. Robert's 89, so he's even a generation, you know, beyond me. And now the 20-year-olds, you know, people ask me all the time in interviews and stuff, what's happening with the 20-year-old men? And one of the things I'm happy to say in response to that question is they're getting information and instruction about emotional intelligence at the age of 25 that some of us didn't get until we were 65.
Absolutely.
And that's the good news. That's the good news. Men are coming forth and parenting their kids like we've never seen before. And yet, I know this sounds maybe a little too much, but I owe him so much. If it hadn't have been for Robert Bly, I don't think that would be as accurate a statement as it just was.
Wow. Well, it's really wonderful because you're able to lay out for our listeners, you know, the history that's gotten us to this point where it is now fairly commonplace for people to be talking about what's happening in men in the 21st century.
That's right.
And the Good Men Project has writers from all over the world.
The Mankind Project.
There's the Mankind Project.
Trainings all over the world.
Yep.
One of my clients, just yesterday, I was talking to him, and he said, "Oh, by the way, I'm going down to Indiana to do the mankind thing that you suggested." And I said, great. And he'll be with 15 guys, 30 guys.
Yeah.
But there'll be 10 mankind, 20 mankind meetings, in the next month, where those 10, 15, or 20 guys will go to, and that mounts up. But the young men, it's like you said, they can talk in ways that I couldn't, Robert couldn't. That's a success story. Now, let's go to the darker side for a minute, okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Here we go. If you turn on any comedy show on television or the internet or Amazon, most of the men portrayed in comedic situations are idiots.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's where the laughter, supposedly laughter, comes from to keep it running. And so in the area of comic television, women are the strong ones and the smart ones and the capable ones, and the men are pictured in those things as just doting idiots, bumbling around, So there's a way in which masculinity in men has improved greatly, but still needs more improvement.
Yeah, it's something that I've observed as well, and it almost seems trying to find a really healthy masculine character in any medium, TV and movies, is pretty difficult. It's like you're either the hyper-masculine warrior who makes fun of guys who have any kind of emotional ability, the hyper-sexed guy, the buffoon, or the doormat.
Yep. Or the one that racking up a body count of 100 dead bodies in their superhero tough guy role. That in some ways, I've never said this before, but I'm going to say it now, in some ways made the macho movie star that I grew up with, John Wayne, makes him look like a pacifist.
That's interesting.
In a John Wayne movie, there might be 3 people killed.
Yeah.
And in a Bruce Willis or Schwarzenegger or
The Rock,
whoever.
Jason Statham.
Yeah, Stratham or Stratham or however his. I mean, before the show's over, they killed 150 people.
Yeah.
And it's totally macho stuff in a way that makes John Wayne look like a liberal pacifist. What I'm saying is I always want to present both sides of the picture. There's really great news happening in the men's community and in the society as a whole. And we still got a lot of work to do.
Amen. Yeah. So, and it's interesting, right? So what do you think of this renaissance of the superhero genre? What do you think that's about?
Well, I think that's an outlet and a cathartic venting for the pent-up anger and rage that we have, the fear that we have, anything from the fear of nuclear annihilation from Russia or some Middle Eastern country. I can't watch these movies and television shows where they're showing going in these macho special forces going into Iraq or Afghanistan. It's almost like we're using the superhero as catharsis. We can't do anything. We feel helpless. And the other thing is that, and this was something Robert really made clear back in the day, we're a sedate masculinity. Robert's generation, and even to some degree mine, we had 3 channels, growing up.
Yeah.
And so if nothing was on, you went outside or you worked or, our masculine and feminine cultures are becoming more sedate, sedentary, and on the computers. on the iPhone, constantly. And therefore, there's not a lot of hands going down into the earth, we might say.
Well, I'll report some good news as a father of a 7-year-old.
Uh-huh.
I think my generation, which was the first generation, really raised on TV, really had the TV as a babysitter, the TV as a parent, the TV as a caretaker.
Y'all had HBO.
And MTV, John. We had HBO, MTV, and we had more accessibility to porn than ever before. And
what we used to think of porn is now regular fare on Cinemax, Showtime, HBO, and y'all were raised with that.
That's right.
We had to pitch in and buy a reel-to-reel that from somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody else. And we'd get it, 2 months later, and it was tame compared to what's on, Cinemax or Showtime. So it is very different, and y'all were raised different, and the generation beneath you is raised even differently. And that's why I keep asking for young men to step forward to speak to those generations. And I keep teaching men, with that in mind, is that you younger guys, like Robert now is 89, he's out of the picture. James Hillman is passed on. The list goes on quite a bit. Sam Keane is no longer really, dealing with any men's stuff anymore. And so really Terrence Real is really one of the most, visible men out there giving information and insights to this whole thing.
I would agree, and I'll say a couple of other things. One, what I've noticed is that my generation and the parents that I'm with that are raising our kids, we are very mindful of how much our kids are outside playing with each other, are getting out, not playing games, not watching TV. My daughter does not watch TV during the week. She gets to watch it on the weekend. And that's not an uncommon practice amongst a lot of us parents. I think we're learning, and I think we hit a point where it was like the hunger for that connection, that hunger for that physical activity, the human need to move and run around, I think is really being instilled. Now, I could be naive, but with the kids that my daughter's with, and she's 7, they are very active. They are out and about. They're not playing a lot of games.
Now, see, that's what I mean right there. See, like on my end of the spectrum, I know for a fact that men are parenting their kids in a way that you are and many men your age and younger. But I didn't know sort of the kids' interpretation or actualization of that. And you just informed me deeply with good news right there.
I think it is good news. Now, people accuse me of being too much of an optimist and looking at the world through rose-colored glasses, but I'm not going to apologize for that because I looked at the world through shit-colored glasses for long enough. What I will say is I had an insight not too long ago, and it's that my daughter and some of the older kids, they did not grow up. They're not growing up with the idea that technology is this kind of unimaginable kind of creation. They're native to it. That's what we call them. They're native to the technology. So for them, they're not consumed by it. It's an extension of who they are. And so many young people are using Facebook and other social media apps and other things to connect in ways that our generations really never have, in really powerful, wonderful ways. And I think it's my generation in particular that struggles the most with technology and balance. And it's our kids that are actually doing it quite well, but we think they're consumed by it because of how well they've integrated it.
I see. That's very insightful. I like that word, native, to it. That's a very, it's like they're indigenous computer savvy people, but I didn't know that. I mean, when I go to the airport, which I do quite often to travel to speak, and I mean, it seems like everybody is on their iPhone, iPad, laptop, or they got headphones tied into Pandora or iTunes. But see, that's me and sort of my, not so much cynicism, but just lack of information, like what you're giving me now.
Well, it's definitely the both and that you talked about. Because that is for sure there. It's almost like in people's small communities and their more inner circles, they're much more connected. But as you kind of, because I travel a lot too, and I see the same thing, and I try to not engage in that. But then there's times where it's like, you know what? This is actually grounding for me. This is actually self-care for me. I've just had a really long week of doing workshops and trainings. I'm drained, and the best thing for me to do is to just go inward, and I'll do that, with some music or meditation apps, those sorts of things. So the interesting thing is you never know how somebody's using the technology, what they're listening to, what they're watching, how they're engaging. So it's definitely a both and there is definitely a dark side. And there's definitely the kids that are still, and these young men that, they've still grown up with so much confusion about what it means to be a man. They've got those mixed messages that you're talking about, and they're going to games and porn and to, drugs, just a lot of confusing outgrowths of what happens when you still don't have a healthy masculinity in the space of this technology.
And that's largely because young men, hell, even old men, I was very fortunate. I can't believe how lucky I was. I mean, in my early 30s, I was taken under the wing of mentors. I mean, really clear mentor / friends. I was really taken under the wing of several really good psychotherapists. I just tried to learn everything I could about everything from them. Most people, men or women, do not have mentors. What they have, and Robert wrote a book about this probably in the early 90s called The Sibling Society. And what he meant by that, in short, is that everybody is sort of a big kid with each other, but there's no adults around, to really mentor them into their masculinity, into their womanhood, into their manhood. And so everybody, including when I was young, we would just piece it together from our comrades and our in-group, But nobody came along to me until I was in my 30s and said, okay, yeah, I'll tell you everything I know. I'll show you everything. And that was partly mine and Robert's relationship is, he and I would go teach these men conferences, and he would tell me stuff that I never had thought about before. And maybe every once in a while I'd tell him something, but it was like that. And others, Bill Stott was a good mentor, Dan Jones. I was just so lucky. And one of the things I've tried to do is be that mentor for as many men as I have and as many men as I can be before I die. That's a missing component in the men's work, is there's just not enough men who take the time, make the time, give their energy to the mentoring process. See, back in the 1800s, 1700s, every student in college would have a mentor, And then by the early 1900s, late 1900s, that just began to fall away. And then certainly in men's work, as you and I are talking about it, there's just not a lot of men out there who are stepping up and saying, I'm here, I'm available to you as a mentor. And again, that's an area that I feel I can still speak to, A, because I've been mentored, and B, because I've mentored quite a few.
Well, I think it's a wonderful component of, I've been blessed too to have some wonderful men who've taken me under their wing. And sometimes their impact has been profound, but their presence has been brief. I've just had some wonderful men. Ernie Larson was one amazing man who was able to mentor me shortly before he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. There's so much I want to talk to you about. I want to come to maybe three more things before we go. The first I want to ask you about is there's this phenomenon that we're seeing. I pay very close attention to what's happening in our culture right now around men and masculinity, and there's lots of different directions that people are going. One of the more common ones, there are these men that are out there and they're saying, we want to get men back in touch with their masculinity, which, okay, I can get behind that. But it's usually so that they can get laid, have more confidence with women, make lots of money. It's a very seemingly superficial invocation of masculinity, and kind of this idea that there are these very sedate men, these men who are really not grounded in any clear sense of who they are, but that for them to really find themselves means they need to get confidence with women, figure out how they can get laid as much as possible, and make lots of money.
Yep, I agree. That's one kind of thing that's been out there, for a little while, and it's not the one that I'm supportive of.
Do you have any other thoughts about that? I mean, are there healthy components to that you can imagine that?
No, not too many as you laid it out there so succinctly. No, I wrote about this a lot in the 90s. I talked about false masculinity. Men would be also pursuing a false femininity. And one of the things that Robert and I and some others in Mankind Project talks about is really a new masculinity, a compassionate but strong masculinity who doesn't need to prove it by acquisitions, whether that's women or material goods. So that is one movement that's out there. It doesn't appeal to me.
Yeah, what's interesting about it, as I've looked a little bit more into it, I was pretty skeptical. And there's some that I think are just very misled and misleading. But as I've gotten to know a couple of them, it's very interesting. It's almost like from the perspective of meeting people where they're at, they start the conversation with men around that very superficial piece, and they use that as a way to bring them in to doing more deeper emotional, spiritual work, and almost getting them to the point where they realize that's not really what they want, or if it is what they want, they have more clarity around it. So it's almost like a backdoor approach to getting men to do more emotional, spiritual work.
Well, now, see, this is very enlightening to me. See, you sort of nailed it best. I can tell you, I started with my first men's thing was in 1976 with a man named Warren Farrell and another man named Herb Goldberg.
Oh, yeah, boy.
These were two guys who, they never really knew what to call themselves, but we would sort of say that they were sort of feminist men movement in a way.
Yeah, sure.
What you said earlier is I can do the history of men's work in this country about as well, I think, as anybody could. But in terms of what's going on currently, I don't have my finger on the pulse nearly as clearly and well as you do. That's very certain to me in this conversation. I mean, I still know how to work with men, and I still know how to help them, face their wounds and their demons and that sort of thing. But in terms of, I used to be a real cultural society student. I kind of knew where things were going and how they were going. But now, I'll be 66 in October, and while I'm not that old, my attention is not focused in some of those areas as clearly as yours is, and other young men.
Yeah.
So this is, again, you're telling me stuff in this conversation that I just didn't know, and I'm very happy to hear.
Well, and I think that's something that I'm very committed to, is the cross-generational conversation and sharing of insight and wisdom and experience, and how critical that is to be able to maintain what you and your generation have learned and taught, what my generation and I are learning and teaching, and the overlap between the two, but the different contexts and the different insights. And then the next generation, if I were to observe something, and maybe it's not accurate, but I don't know that I've seen the real commitment to generativity in the cross transgenerational aspect of the men's kind of movement, or the men, this men's consciousness. Am I off about that? Or, I mean, you have better sense than I would.
No, I think you're right about that. Maybe, and I have talked to some men about this over the last year or two, is maybe it's time to cycle back and have sort of a renaissance period for men's issues, men's work again. It's just going to take, well, I hate to say it, but it's true. If the media doesn't find it interesting again, then it'll just be done in little spurts and dribs and drabs. Whereas when Robert came on the scene, this was so new,
Yeah.
And me too, to some degree. I was in every magazine, New York Times, LA Times. People wanted to know about this thing. Now, consequently, let me just go back to the history a little bit. Around 1992, 93, once again, the comedy shows then caricatured the men's movement.
Yes.
Every show that was a comedy show, at one episode or another, they would have men sitting by a campfire, hugging trees, beating drums, all as a means to caricature it, as opposed to really get it. One time, Dan, myself, Robert Bly, and the wonderful therapist Robert Moore, the three of us had just finished doing a men's thing up in Michigan, a really good men's weekend, and we were staying at a bed and breakfast. That morning we were eating, and a couple of tables over, a man was reading a newspaper. And he didn't know who we were, and of course we didn't say anything. But what we heard him saying to his wife was, "You know what, hon, I was really thinking about doing one of these men's things that they're talking about. But in this article, it just makes it sound like they're so silly, and I just don't think I'm going to do it." And I thought, see, there's where the thing, in a way, men, this is, I think, true now for any generation. If you don't have somebody to support you to go inside, then you'll keep going outside.
And of course, you mean going within yourself versus externally focused. Yeah.
And see, that was the thing that Robert and I agreed on. We didn't want the men's movement to be a political thing like the women's movement. We wanted, they needed to go outside. They needed to change the structures, the businesses, unfair income, and still do, by the way. But men needed to go inside, we thought, and fit themselves in ways that our fathers did not.
Like I said, there's so much that I would love to talk to you about. Maybe you'd be willing to come on the podcast again some point.
Sure. We'll have a episode 2 or
I'd love it. Before we go, what I'd love for you to do, so I have at the end of each podcast, I have what I call my practical and tactical point. It's really kind of, let's get down to brass tacks. So before we get into that, I would love for you to just speak a little bit about the amazing work that you've done around anger and rage. I mean, we all know that, I mean, if there's one emotion that men are allowed still in our society, it's more anger. And
all right, now let me speak to that, because that's what all of us think until they hear my lecture on it.
Exactly.
Men are allowed to rage, and our society pays men to rage, whether it's comedic, football, soccer. When I started out on this anger stuff is I've written 3 books on it so far, and what I say in all of them is anger is a feeling. It's an emotion. Rage is an action or a behavior that numbs men's emotions. See, so like if a man really was to feel anger, he would, most of them, until they've been working with, are scared of it. And also a lot of men, especially in relationships, if a man gets scared, he doesn't go to anger, he goes to rage. So that he temporarily, momentarily looks stronger than he's really feeling. And what I've been trying to do is to tell men and women, listen, you have a right to your emotion of anger, but you don't have a right to rage at anybody. Not your kids, not the other countries, not your spouse, not your parents, but you do have a right to be angry. And so I've spent 25 years or more trying to get that across. And when I teach clinicians about it, they all go, my God, that makes so much sense. Rage is an action or a behavior. So if a man is sad and he wasn't taught to be okay with that, he might go into a rage, you see. But anger itself is about as taboo for men as it was for women, and it was extremely taboo for women.
That's really what I was hoping you would touch on, because we had a conference 2 years ago, and it was a conference, really, it was an attempt in the addictions field particularly, but one part that I'm really passionate about is really getting our culture to better understand shame and trauma from a man's perspective. So we had this conference, and you came, and it was so wonderful. You came and you sat on the stage, no PowerPoint, no nothing. You know, you just had a conversation with the audience. But if there's one presentation, when I meet people and talk to people about that conference, if there's one presentation that people, especially the men, keep coming back to, it's that distinction between anger and rage. And that amazing work that you've done. And so I really wanted to call that out so that our listeners...
Well, the next time we talk, I mean, this has been sort of focused on men and the society and culture in which we live in. One of the things we might do another time is really go into that material a little bit more deeper, both for men and women.
I'd love it. I'd love to focus the conversation on really helping our audience understand the difference between anger and rage and just, you know, because there's still so many men, and I know you know this, but, you know, it's still in my generation and the younger generation, if there's one thing that's still, while there's that emotional intelligence, there's still that real deep kind of prohibition against vulnerability, particularly for men. And so the amount of anger that so many men or rage and anger and confusion and shame that's kind of all boiled together that men are walking around with, whether it's turned inward or turned outward, it's still epidemic.
Yes, that's exactly right. It is epidemic. And one of the things that we're doing now, I'm sad to say, is we're projecting that rage onto people of other color and other religions that we have not done in a long, long time.
Yeah.
I mean, we've always done it to some degree, but right now we seem to be expressing rage at some of the deepest levels in the culture I've seen. Just to sort of end up here, you know, one of the things that happened in the men's movement is Robert Bly was the one who brought men to the door of their grief.
Yes, yes.
But he hadn't done any anger work himself, and he therefore did not teach anger work really in his seminars and conferences. And that's where I stepped in and said, you know, it's really both. Most people who really will do the deepest anger work will also tap deeply into grief. And so you put those two together a little bit, and you've got a little bit more balanced kind of thing. And he recognized that, and I recognized what he was doing. And so for 20 years, we got to teach together, and it was one of the best periods of my whole life to be able to do that.
It really is wonderful. I look forward to when we can have that really focused conversation and helping people understand what is anger work and maybe where some of these men's retreats and workshops have gone awry. And that's been part of the backlash of, you know, not creating enough safety, not creating spaces.
Right. That's exactly right. When I opened the Austin Men's Center here in 1986, under the sign of Austin Men's Center that was on our building, one of the key phrases underneath that was creating a safe place. So we'll talk about those and other things whenever you feel you have time and the opportunity, and just be back in touch, and we'll do that. Thank you so much for today. You've taught me so much and given me a lot of perspective that I didn't have, so I really appreciate that.
Oh, it's wonderful. It's wonderful to have you. Could I get one last thing from you, and that is, if you were, in thinking about our folks today, if you were from the practical and tactical component, if you were to give them 3 key takeaways as they're kind of stepping into understanding men's work, what would you tell them?
I'd tell them that men are hurting in ways that most men themselves don't know, and many women certainly don't know. I would tell men that they must do and reduce the anger that they carry in their bodies decade after decade. And then third, just like we were talking about, Robert said, and I'll close it with his advice because he was so good and I love him so much. He said grief was the doorway into true masculinity.
Boy, I believe that.
So we're in a period now in our society where we need to get rightfully, appropriately angry about the conditions in which we're seeing, and we also have to grieve our losses, grieve our changes, grieve our transitions. Those two things are still, no matter what age a man is, those things are still essential.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, John, for joining me. I truly look forward to our next conversation.
Me too, Dan. Thank you so much, and we'll talk again. And when this is done and out, I want to get it up on my website and also make it available on a CD, perhaps for people in different places. Go to johnleebooks.com. That's got my schedule and my books and the areas in which I work. And johnleebooks.com.
Great, johnleebooks.com, and we'll put more of your contact information on the website. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Dan. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye. Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Man Rules Podcast, where we don't let the rules rule us. If you have ideas for guests, topics, or even want to be a guest, send us an email at ideas@themanrules.com and check out our website and everything we're up to at themanrules.com. The only question we have to ask is what kind of man you want to be and what's keeping you from being that man.